Hi, I'm Christina Lowry, and I am a photographer and intermedia artist here in Brisbane. My latest exhibition, Historia Naturalis, or Natural History, is a collection of photographs and sculptures responding to nature and the environment. I quite often use taxidermy and skulls and old sort of items in my work, drawing on the history of art, natural history, and the connection to science. This piece in particular was inspired by a behind-the-scenes visit to the Queensland Museum's storage in Hendra, and that's where they have all of their kind of pickled animal parts. And this collection of pieces is actually faux kind of pieces that I've made out of wax, but using also birds that have died from roadkill. But the piece is called Birdwatching 2124. So it's basically a little bit dystopian look at the future of what bird watching might look like in 100 years from now if we don't do something to protect the environment now. So these series of works were a kind of investigation into ideas of preservation and this sort of European exceptionalism that comes up in things like understanding the world, naming the world, discovering animals that had already been known for a very long time by the Indigenous peoples of those areas. But yeah, classifying, taxonomy, all of these things I find really interesting. But also the way that sometimes preservation isn't actual preservation, the way that we have treated animals, our relationship, our human to animal relationship is quite often detrimental to the animal. And so that's kind of what I was trying to express here. These birds have been preserved by being cryovac. They are all a result of roadkill, window strikes, and this one was actually a beloved pet that someone sent to me. But so yeah, looking at our relationship to these animals and this idea of preservation where the cryovac is preserving these frozen birds, but at the same time it's damaging them, so much like our relationships to the environment. So I'm very fortunate to be able to borrow a lot of taxidermy specimens from the Queensland Museum Loan Centre at Hendra. And this piece here is referencing the Victorian era's love for cloches in their drawing rooms filled with little birds. Quite often in the Victorian era, the English were obsessed with hummingbirds, and they were quite often sent over from America, to the extent that some of these birds almost became extinct because they were so loved for their jewelled colours. So these kind of cloches were very common, and they were meant to show one's connection and love of nature. So there's a little irony in that. But this piece is, yeah, drawing on those kind of ideas, drawing on our relationships to animals and the way that we process animals in many different ways of our life. And this piece is just stuffed full of these beautiful Australian native taxidermy specimens that are no longer fit for display. So I made this piece homage to Humboldt. It contains a taxidermy rat, which is the second or third taxidermy rat that I have prepared myself. I'm really fascinated by the art of taxidermy, and I wanted to create this piece in homage to Humboldt, who was a German 17th century scientist who is considered the father of ecology. He took to studying in North America the animals, the environment, the geography. He was the first person to really realise that rather than looking at specimens individually in a museum, we needed to look at the whole, the entire ecology, the relationships between the animals, the plants, the mountains. And so this piece represents relationships between these animals. So there's a rat, there's a little taxidermy finch, and it lays on a tiny little book of Shakespeare to represent us. And then the insects that cover the rat, again, the really important and often unseen creatures that we rely on in our environment. And these were the kind of things that he was studying and bringing home. So yes, this is my little homage to Humboldt. So recently I've been studying the Umwelt of animals, or almost like a bubble that each animal lives inside and how it experiences the world. So we experience the world in a way that makes sense to us, and we're highly visual. Other animals like bats aren't visual, rather they rely on echolocation and communicating at a frequency that we can't hear. So their umwelt is very different to ours. My love and passion always comes back to birds and insects. And in this case, I was thinking about the unknowability of birds, that despite being ubiquitous in our environment, we see them on a daily basis. And particularly during COVID, trapped at home, birds were quite often the part of nature that we were able to connect with and feel a connection with. And quite often we project part of ourselves onto birds and their behaviours, whether they're happy, whether they're mourning, whether they're cunning. But the thing that I really love is that as a scientist, we can understand a bird's brain, their body, their anatomy. And as people, we have a relationship to birds. But there's this space in the middle, this Umwelt, this piece that we just can't understand because we're not birds. And I wanted to try and capture that somehow. And so these are my attempts at capturing the unknowability of birds. So they're shadowy, some are quite easy to pick out. The shapes, they're recognisable as birds, but their colours, their thought patterns, their private lives, they're not for us to understand in this instance. Instead, it's a point to ponder the beauty that is not knowing something when we are often driven by our curiosity to understand. So this is a beginning of a series of works that I've been doing with 3D printing. I discovered 3D printing through my local library, where you can use a free platform called Thingiverse and print 3D items and anything you can imagine, basically. So Thingiverse, I got on there and I was exploring everything from key rings to chess pieces. But the thing that I kept noticing was how much nature, how much we were reiterating nature on this platform to be printed. And it drew me back to my interest in cabinets of curiosity and Wunderkammer, and our need to collect, our curiosity about the world, our need to understand, while also living in this really fraught environmental age. And as a mother of 3 children, I've often had to empty their pockets full of seeds and shells and bits and pieces. And I wonder for future generations where there is a decrease in insects and bugs and snails. How will we awaken that curiosity in our children? Will that continue? And what does it say about our relationship to nature? And so when I discovered that people were reiterating things from their collections like fossils, scanning things, remaking things like this beautiful mushroom, these shells, these beetles and skulls, spiders, twigs, I was so fascinated. And what I wanted to do was make a kind of modern cabinet of curiosities, a modern Wunderkammer, a modern collection. And this was the work that I created as a result of that. So part of this series, A Longing for Wonder, this is a longing number 1, again, a cloche, and it's filled with 3D printed Goliath beetles. And then the artist, Christine Grace, has painted one of these little 3D beetles to resemble an actual Goliath beetle. And the thing that I find really fascinating, again, about our need to collect and our curiosity and our our longing for nature is that these beetles are highly collectible amongst those who have these little cabinets of curiosity, or amongst those who collect insects, butterflies, etc., because the Goliath beetle is one of the largest in the world. And in Australia, we have a lot of regulations surrounding our native wildlife. Flora and fauna, heavily protected, but insects, not so much. They can be bought, sold, traded, killed, what have you, and it tends to be the same around the world. In particular, where these Goliath beetles come from, they are poached from the wild because we still don't understand their full breeding cycle. So we can't kind of grow them, farm them to meet the desires of collectors. So instead they're poached from the wild and their numbers are dwindling. And I think a lot of people probably don't understand that just, buying a beetle or buying a preserved flying fox or bat or what have you, all of these animals have been poached from the wild and are having a real impact. And so, yes, this was my kind of reflection on that desire to collect, that wanting to own one of the largest beetles in the world, and what does that mean? And then what does that mean in the future for the environment and for the next generations? So one of my greatest passions is working with flowers, working with insects, working with the things that I've collected because I'm a compulsive bowerbird. And thinking about memento mori, thinking about this too shall pass, thinking about our time on the planet, and kind of, again, reaching back through art history to an era where the Dutch in particular I find really inspiring, and during the 17th century they were Protestant rather than Catholic, and therefore they didn't paint Jesus and Mary, they were painting these beautiful still lifes, portraits, landscapes. But I've always been drawn to this kind of flower, still life pieces and the symbolism inherent in them, and the mixture of living and dead and dying pieces, again as a reflection on life and death. So this piece here, again, thank you to the Queensland Museum and the Loan Centre in Hendra, is a sort of landscape that features all of these beautiful discarded taxidermy birds. And you can see one of the old tags here, and you can see that they are all past their prime. They have been on display or they have been study aids, and this is what remains of them. And there's a tension there. There's a lot of tension for people. They find this, and they've told me that they find this piece quite unsettling because our relationship to taxidermy has changed a lot, and it's something that's gone in and out of fashion and in and out of favour. And although we're used to seeing taxidermy in museums, we no longer see it in everybody's houses, in every pub and parlour, etc. But it just, it brings death to the fore, and it creates something that isn't alive, it isn't quite dead. It's not a sculpture, but it's not a toy, it's this kind of in-between state. And often with taxidermy, it's the closest that we can get to these animals. In real life, they'd fly away, or they'd be high in a tree or something. We wouldn't be able to get close to them. But with these beautiful taxidermy pieces, we can study them, we can touch them, we can feel them. And I think, in a way, in an odd way, it helps us create a stronger bond to our wildlife. So this piece, A Longing for Wonder too, again draws on these sort of white 3D printed pieces from nature that have been sourced from Thingiverse and are reiterations of real pieces of nature. And they are printed in a filament that is compostable and known as an ecoplastic. It's plant-based. And it sits in this vitrine, referencing cabinets of curiosity again, but on the floor, almost like a coffin, sort of speaking to this idea about loss in the Anthropocene and the stark number of insects and plants that have become extinct within this human-made era. I really love this piece. Again, these books are from my collection, and this is one of the pieces that I borrowed from the Queensland Museum. And you can see that this bird has had many lives and potentially passed through many hands. And I find the kind of the relationship, the juxtaposition between the natural and the man-made, but they're both sort of about, again, curiosity, learning, science, and our way of trying to understand the world. And yet, quite often, our way of understanding the world is by destroying it. So my process as a photographer, I work generally with natural light, and I work with a florist, Amy at Unveiling Poppy, who together we design and create these gorgeous flower arrangements. And I source all these little props, all these little pieces. I've been studying entomology and taxidermy, and you'll look closely and see things like butterflies, the painted 3D printed beetle, a little Gordian finch and another Gordian finch. And again, they're kind of these meditations on life and death and the environment. And they're quite beautiful, but they kind of have a bit of a macabre element about them as well too. And they're all, you know, really beautifully, lovingly staged and then edited, because I want them to take on sort of the tones of the old masters that we see these days before they've been cleaned up. And the finishes have sort of yellowed over time. And I really am drawn to that. It just really speaks to me. And when they do those kind of before and after pictures of cleaning up paintings, I generally like the before better. But yeah, I just really love working with flowers, love working with taxidermy and introducing little elements like this blue bee into the piece. And again, you know, drawing from my collections and my curiosities about nature. These are nests that I have collected and little eggs, my books, and this beautiful, it's actually a glass, a beer mug from the 17th century. And you'll notice that in many of the paintings of the era from the Dutch masters, they use this exact glass. And so I was very fortunate to find one and have it made for me, to find a maker who could make it for me. And here again is our little blue bee and a dragonfly here. And yeah, more kind of musings on nature and our relationships